There are moments in history that have been quietly erased from our textbooks. Erased not because they were ordinary failures, but because they are simply too unsettling to explain to the modern mind. We are taught that medical science is a straight line. We want to believe in a steady, unbroken march from the dark ages of ignorance into the bright, sterile light of modern understanding. We trust that the treatments of the past, however primitive, were stepping stones that logically led us to the safety of the present day. But if you dig deep enough into the forgotten archives of the 19th century, beneath the dust of abandoned theories and discarded journals, you will find a story that shatters this comforting illusion. A story of desperate men, dying patients, and a terrifying medical procedure that replaced human blood with something entirely different. A procedure that turned human veins a pale, unnatural white. We are told it was a mere mistake, a bizarre, short-lived fad, born of desperation during a time of plague. But when you look closer at the records, at the dates, at the sheer number of highly educated men who championed this procedure for decades, the official explanation begins to unravel. What really happened in those dimly lit hospital wards? And what did those Victorian doctors see that made them believe they had discovered the ultimate secret to human vitality? The year was 1854. The place was Toronto, Canada. The city, like much of the world at the time, was entirely consumed by fear. A severe cholera epidemic was sweeping through the population. Cholera was a particularly horrifying disease, often called the, quote, Blue Death. It struck with terrifying speed, stripping the human body of its fluids in a matter of hours. Patients would lose water so rapidly that their blood would literally thicken inside their veins, turning into a dark, sluggish sludge. Their skin would turn a ghastly shade of blue due to the lack of oxygen, and their eyes would sink deep into their skulls. They were dying of absolute dehydration, their circulatory systems collapsing as their blood volume plummeted to fatal levels. Inside the overcrowded, makeshift cholera sheds of Toronto, the air was thick with the smell of lime and decay. Here we find two respected physicians, Dr. James Bovell and Dr. Edwin Hodder. These were not quacks or fringe practitioners. They were men of science, desperate to find a way to save the sea of dying patients before them. They knew that to save a cholera victim, they had to replenish the fluids in their veins. But in 1854, the science of intravenous therapy was virtually non-existent. Blood transfusions were considered a near-certain death sentence. Without any knowledge of blood types, which would not be discovered until 1901, transferring blood from one human to another almost always resulted in catastrophic immune reactions. The recipient's blood would coagulate, their kidneys would fail, and they would die in agony. Bovell and Hodder needed a substitute. They needed a fluid that could act like blood, but without the deadly consequences. And they found their answer not in a laboratory, but in a pasture. They decided to inject their patients with milk. The mainstream official narrative of this event is usually presented as a brief, embarrassing footnote in medical history. According to modern textbooks, the milk transfusions of the 1850s were a classic example of flawed Victorian logic. The accepted explanation goes like this. Physicians of the era noticed that when human blood was separated, it contained a milky white substance, which we now know as plasma and white blood cells. They also studied chyle, a milky fluid found in the lymphatic system that is formed during the digestion of fatty foods. Through a massive leap of misguided logic, they concluded that chyle, blood, and milk were fundamentally related. They theorized that the minute oily and fatty particles found in fresh milk could be injected directly into the human bloodstream, where the body would magically transmute them into white corpuscles, or white blood cells. Milk, they reasoned, was the ultimate nourishing fluid. It was the first food of life. Therefore, injecting it directly into the veins of a dying man would provide instant nourishment and replace the fluids lost to cholera. And so, the official story tells us that Bovell and Hodder brought a cow directly up to the doors of the cholera shed. They milked the animal through a piece of gauze into a bowl, warming it to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, using a large brass syringe, they slowly pushed 12 ounces of this raw, warm cow's milk directly into the veins of a 40-year-old man named Harrison, who was in the final, agonizing stages of cholera. Against all modern medical logic, Harrison survived. In fact, his condition rapidly improved. Encouraged by this impossible success, the doctors tried it again on other patients. The official history states that while a couple of early patients showed temporary improvement, the next 5 patients died shortly after the procedure. The medical community eventually realized the folly of injecting dairy into the human cardiovascular system. The practice was universally condemned, and science moved on to develop the safe, intravenous saline drips we use today. It is a neat, tidy story, a story of a foolish hypothesis, a brief experiment, and a swift correction by the scientific method. But there is a problem with this narrative. a significant, glaring discrepancy that history has chosen to overlook. If the milk transfusions were such an obvious, immediate disaster, why didn't the practice stop in 1854? When we open the medical journals from the years following the Toronto cholera epidemic, we do not see a swift abandonment of milk transfusions. Instead, we see something deeply unsettling. The practice spread. It crossed borders. It was adopted by some of the most prestigious medical minds in North America, and it persisted for nearly 30 years. Why would brilliant men of science continue to inject milk into human beings for 3 decades if it was nothing but a lethal failure? Let us transition from the accepted narrative and look closely at the records. The first crack in the official story appears in the 1870s, 20 years after the Toronto experiments. We find ourselves in New York City, looking at the work of Dr. T. Gaillard Thomas. Dr. Thomas was not a rogue doctor. He was a highly esteemed physician, a pioneer in women's health, and a respected voice in the medical community. Dr. Thomas became a fierce advocate for intravenous milk transfusions, particularly for women suffering from severe hemorrhages during childbirth. He publicly declared that the injection of milk in place of blood was a, quote, perfectly feasible, safe, and legitimate procedure. He was not alone. Across the country, doctors were publishing case reports detailing the successful use of intravenous milk for anemia, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, and severe bleeding. They were not using small amounts either. They were injecting 6, 8, sometimes 12 ounces of raw animal milk directly into the human circulatory system. The modern mind recoils at this. Today we know that injecting even a small amount of unpasteurized foreign protein directly into the blood should trigger massive anaphylactic shock. It should cause acute respiratory distress, severe immune rejection, systemic clotting, and almost immediate death. Yet, the records from the 1870s clearly document patients surviving. Some patients, heavily depleted of blood, were reported to have color return to their cheeks moments after the milk entered their veins. Their pulses steadied. They sat up in bed. How is this possible? The official narrative dismisses these survivals as mere flukes, attributing them to the patients recovering naturally, despite the doctor's dangerous interventions. But when you read the first-hand accounts, the doctors are describing an immediate, visible, and profound physical reaction to the milk. This brings us to the most disturbing discrepancy of all, the documented side effects. When the procedure went wrong, which it often did, the patients did not just quietly pass away from infection. The doctors recorded a very specific, recurring set of symptoms that accompanied the fatal reactions. Patients would suddenly complain of crushing chest pain. They would develop an intense burning fever. And then, almost uniformly, the doctors noted a symptom called nystagmus. Nystagmus is a condition where the eyes make rapid, involuntary, repetitive movements. The patient's eyes would dart violently back and forth, or up and down, completely out of their control. Shortly after this terrifying display, they would slip into a deep coma from which they would never wake. Why would milk in the blood cause the eyes to involuntarily dart around the room? This is a neurological symptom. It suggests that the milk was not just causing an immune reaction, it was crossing the blood-brain barrier. It was interacting with the central nervous system in a way that remains entirely unexplained by the simple allergic reaction theory. Let us dig deeper into the investigative core of this mystery. By the late 1870s, the debate over milk transfusions was tearing the medical community apart. Some doctors swore by its life-saving miracles, while others viewed it as an abomination. To settle the matter, an ambitious physician named Dr. Joseph Howe decided to conduct a series of controlled experiments. Dr. Howe wanted to prove whether it was the milk itself that was killing patients, or the quantity being used. He began by systematically bleeding a series of dogs until they lost consciousness. He then attempted to resuscitate them by injecting them with raw animal milk. Every single dog died. This should have been the end of the story. The animal trials were a catastrophic failure. But Dr. Howe noticed something strange. He hypothesized that the issue was not the milk itself, but the fact that he was crossing species lines. He believed that cow or goat milk was fundamentally incompatible with canine blood, just as it might be incompatible with human blood. So in 1880, Dr. Howe took the experiment to its logical and perhaps most disturbing conclusion. He gathered 3 ounces of human breast milk. He found a patient who was dying, a woman who had stopped breathing and required resuscitation, and he injected the human milk directly into her veins. The records of what happened next are sparse, heavily sanitized, and difficult to verify. But we know the outcome. The woman died. The human milk did not save her. It was shortly after this final, grim experiment that the medical establishment finally, officially, closed the book on milk transfusions. In the 1880s, The development of intravenous saline solutions provided a safe, inert way to rehydrate patients, and the milk syringes were quietly locked away in the dark cabinets of medical history. But as investigators of the past, we must ask, did Dr. Howe's final failure really explain the decades of reported successes? If milk transfusions were universally lethal, how do we explain the man named Harrison in 1854? How do we explain Dr. T. Gaillard Thomas's surviving hemorrhage patients? How do we explain the dozens of published case studies detailing miraculous recoveries? Is it possible that the official story is hiding a profound biological mystery? Let us step outside the boundaries of mainstream history and consider the alternate theories. Let us look at the hidden patterns that the medical establishment may have willfully ignored. Theory number 1 involves a concept we are only beginning to fully understand today: the extreme power of raw immunology. In the 1850s, pasteurization did not exist. The milk used by Bovell, Hodder, and Thomas was completely raw, fresh from the animal, and still warm with body heat. Modern science knows that raw milk is not just a collection of fats and proteins. It is a highly complex, living fluid. It is packed with millions of active white blood cells, natural killer cells, stem cells, enzymes, and a vast array of antibodies. When a patient was dying of cholera, their immune system was entirely compromised. Is it possible that by injecting fresh, living animal milk directly into the bloodstream, these doctors were accidentally performing a primitive, interspecies immune system transplant? Could the massive influx of living bovine antibodies and white blood cells have triggered an extreme, desperate biological war inside the patient's veins? A war that, in a few rare cases like Harrison's, completely overwhelmed the cholera bacteria? The terrifying side effects, the fever, the crushing chest pain, the frantic darting of the eyes, these are the exact symptoms of a massive cytokine storm, a violent overreaction of the immune system. Perhaps the doctors of the 19th century had unwittingly stumbled upon a brutal, high-stakes form of immunotherapy. It was a gamble that killed most, but for a select few, the raw biological power of the milk literally shocked their dying bodies back to life. But there is a second theory, one that is far more mysterious and deeply connected to how the Victorians actually viewed human life. It is the theory of vitalism. Today, we view the human body as an incredibly complex machine. Blood is a delivery system for oxygen. The heart is a pump. The brain is a computer. If you lose fluid, you replace it with sterile, laboratory-made salt water. But in the 1850s, medicine was still heavily influenced by the philosophy of vitalism. They believed that living things contained a vital spark, a non-physical life force that animated the flesh. Blood was not just a chemical compound. It was the physical manifestation of this life force. It was a living tissue. When Bovell and Hodder brought that cow to the cholera shed, they did not just want its fluids. They explicitly stated that the milk had to be freshly drawn and living. Dr. Thomas later echoed this exact sentiment, insisting that only milk removed from a healthy animal within a few minutes of the injection could be used. Why was the freshness so crucial? Because they believed the milk contained the vital spark of the animal. They believed that by transferring this warm, living fluid from a healthy creature into a dying human, they were literally transferring the essence of life itself. What if the reason milk transfusions were ultimately suppressed was not just because of the death toll, but because they challenged the emerging, mechanistic view of modern science? By the late 19th century, medicine was desperate to be seen as a hard, exact science. They wanted predictability. They wanted sterile laboratories, chemical formulas, and standardized treatments. Intravenous saline fit this new world perfectly. Saline is dead. It is predictable. It is easily controlled. Milk, on the other hand, was chaotic. It was alive. Its effects were wildly unpredictable, sometimes causing horrifying deaths, and sometimes causing inexplicable, miraculous recoveries. The milk transfusions represented an older, darker, more organic form of medicine, a medicine that believed human life was tied to the raw, untamed vitality of nature. To the new generation of clinical scientists, the sight of a doctor pumping raw animal fluids into a human vein looked like witchcraft. It looked like ancient alchemy. And so, the successes were buried, the failures were highlighted, and the entire era was written off as a collective delusion. But what if we look at the most damning evidence of all? The forgotten testimonies of the survivors themselves. Hidden deep within the archives of the era, beneath the clinical reports of doctors, there are fleeting mentions of the patients who lived through the procedure. Those who survived the milk transfusions often reported a strange, lingering sensation long after their recovery. They did not just feel cured of their disease. They reported feeling a strange, unnatural vitality, a surging energy that felt foreign to their own bodies. Some observers at the time, deeply unsettled by these recoveries, whispered that the patients had been fundamentally changed, that by receiving the living essence of an animal directly into their heart, a part of their humanity had been permanently altered. The rapid, involuntary darting of the eyes, the nystagmus that haunted the dying, was seen by some not as a neurological glitch, but as a terrifying physical rejection of a foreign soul trying to take root in a human vessel. Of course, modern science dismisses all of this. We know now that milk cannot turn into white blood cells. We know that cross-species fluid injection is a recipe for disaster. We know that the vital spark is a philosophical myth, and that a human being is nothing more than biology and chemistry. The official story tells us that we have moved past the dark, ignorant days of the 1850s. We have sanitized our medicine. We have purified our treatments. We know exactly how the body works. But history is rarely as neat and sterile as we want it to be. The archives remain, gathering dust, filled with the handwritten notes of brilliant men who watched pale white fluid bring dead men back to life. Perhaps it really was just a series of fortunate accidents. Perhaps the surviving patients merely experienced a temporary rush of hydration that their bodies somehow managed to tolerate. Maybe the official narrative is exactly right, and there is nothing hidden beneath the surface. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize. Maybe, in our rush to turn the human body into a predictable machine, we have forgotten the chaotic, terrifying, and deeply mysterious nature of life itself. What else lies buried in the shadows of our history, waiting to be found? And if we ever discover the true limits of what the human body can endure, will we be brave enough to accept it?